Deep inside the frozen Ural Mountains of the Soviet Union, 9 experienced hikers began a journey that would become one of history's greatest mysteries. They were young, strong, highly trained, and confident in their ability to survive one of the harshest winter expeditions imaginable. But none of them ever returned. Weeks later, search teams found their campsite. The tent was still standing, but something was terribly wrong. The fabric had been sliced open from the inside. Inside the tent, their boots remained, their heavy winter jackets remained. Food, cameras, and personal belongings were all left behind. Outside, a trail of footprints disappeared into the snow. Some belonged to people wearing only socks. Some appeared barefoot. The temperature that night is believed to have dropped below -30 degrees Celsius. Why would experienced mountaineers abandon the safety of their shelter, without proper clothing, in the middle of a deadly winter night? The answers became even more disturbing. 2 bodies were discovered beneath a giant cedar tree. 3 more lay scattered across the mountainside, as if they had been desperately trying to return to their tent. Months later, the remaining 4 hikers were found buried beneath deep snow in a nearby ravine. Several had devastating internal injuries: broken ribs, crushed skulls. One victim was missing her tongue. Investigators searched for answers. The Soviet government opened an official investigation. But when the case was finally closed, the explanation was unlike anything anyone expected. The hikers, officials concluded, had died because of an unknown compelling force. More than 65 years later, scientists, historians, and investigators are still asking the same question. What really happened at Dyatlov Pass? The expedition. To understand this mystery, we first need to meet the people behind it. These were not inexperienced tourists. They were skilled winter hikers. Most were students or recent graduates of the Ural Polytechnic Institute. Each had completed demanding expeditions before. Together, they had the experience needed to earn the Soviet Union's highest certification for long-distance winter hiking. The expedition was led by Igor Dyatlov, a 23-year-old radio engineering student, quiet, organized, and respected by his friends. His leadership and planning skills made him the natural choice to lead the journey. The group originally consisted of 10 members, but before reaching the mountains, one hiker became ill. His name was Yuri Yudin. He suffered from severe joint pain and decided he could not continue. Reluctantly, he said goodbye to the others and returned home alone. It was a heartbreaking decision. At the time, he believed he had failed his team. Instead, that choice saved his life. Yuri Yudin would become the only survivor of the expedition. The remaining 9 hikers pressed on. Their destination was Mount Atorton, one of the most remote areas in the northern Ural Mountains. The route stretched for hundreds of kilometers across snow-covered wilderness. Temperatures regularly fell below -25 degrees Celsius. Powerful winds, deep snow, and complete isolation made this one of the Soviet Union's most challenging winter expeditions. Yet the hikers appeared confident. Throughout the journey, they laughed together, took photographs, wrote diary entries, and carefully recorded their progress. Those journals, along with the photographs they left behind, would later become some of the most important pieces of evidence in the entire investigation. On January 23, 1959, the team left Sverdlovsk by train. Their spirits were high. Friends and family wished them luck. No one imagined that this would be the last time many of them would ever be seen alive. After several days of travel, they reached the edge of the wilderness. From there, the real expedition began. The hikers strapped on their skis, loaded their heavy backpacks, and disappeared into the endless white landscape. For several days, everything went according to plan. They followed their route, camped each night, shared meals, took photographs, and continued deeper into the mountains. But winter in the Urals can change without warning. As February approached, the weather began to worsen. Snowfall increased, visibility dropped, powerful winds swept across the mountainsides. The journey became slower and far more dangerous. On February 1st, the group made a decision that would later become one of the most debated moments in the entire case. Instead of continuing into the shelter of a nearby forest, they pitched their tent on the exposed eastern slope of a mountain known as Kolatsyakl. In the language of the indigenous Mansi people, the name is commonly translated as Dead Mountain. Despite its ominous reputation, historians believe the name most likely referred to the mountain's lack of wildlife rather than any supernatural legend. The hikers carefully secured their tent, prepared for another freezing night, recorded the day's events, and settled in to rest. No one knows exactly what happened after darkness fell, because from that moment forward, the expedition enters history's darkest chapter. The last night. The date was February 1st, 1959. By late afternoon, the weather had changed dramatically. Strong winds swept across the mountains, snow reduced visibility. The temperature continued to fall. The hikers had planned to reach the protection of a nearby forest, but poor visibility caused them to lose their intended route. Instead of turning back, they stopped on the open slope of Kolatsyakl. It was not an ideal campsite. The mountainside offered little shelter from the wind. Yet experienced mountaineers sometimes chose exposed locations to avoid losing altitude and to make it easier to continue their journey the next morning. Working together, the team cut into the snow. They created a flat platform and carefully pitched their large canvas tent. Photographs recovered from their cameras later showed them smiling, digging through the snow, and preparing camp. Nothing in those final images suggested panic or fear. As darkness settled over the mountain, the hikers likely prepared dinner. They changed into warmer clothing, recorded notes in their journals, and settled in for another freezing winter night. Outside, the wind howled across the empty mountainside. Inside the tent, 9 people tried to rest before continuing their expedition the next morning. Then, something happened. No one knows exactly what. There were no survivors, no eyewitnesses, no final diary entries. Only the silent evidence left behind in the snow. At some point during the night, the hikers suddenly abandoned their tent. Not through the entrance, but by cutting their way out from the inside. Investigators would later confirm that several long cuts had been made through the fabric using a knife. Whatever caused the group to leave, they chose the fastest possible escape. Even more confusing, they left behind almost everything needed to survive. Their heavy winter coats remained inside. Most of their boots were still in the tent. Food, equipment, blankets, and personal belongings were untouched. Imagine standing outside in complete darkness. The temperature well below freezing, powerful winds driving snow across the mountainside, and yet choosing to leave without your boots or your coat. Experienced hikers understood exactly how deadly those conditions were. They would never do this, unless they believed staying inside the tent was even more dangerous. But what could create that kind of fear? An avalanche? A sudden collapse of snow? Violent winds? Or something else entirely? That question has haunted investigators for decades. The footprints found later would only deepen the mystery. They did not suggest a frantic escape. Instead, many appeared calm. Some hikers walked, others followed behind. There was no clear evidence of a chaotic stampede. The footprints stretched downhill, toward a forest approximately 1.5 kilometers away, as if the group believed they would eventually return. But they never did. Somewhere between the tent and the trees, their struggle for survival had begun. Without proper clothing, every minute mattered. In temperatures estimated between -25 and -30 degrees Celsius, the human body loses heat with terrifying speed. Hands become numb. Thoughts grow slower. Simple decisions become difficult. Eventually, the cold itself begins to affect judgment. Despite these impossible conditions, the hikers stayed together. At least, at first. Evidence suggests they moved as a group toward the forest. There, they hoped to find protection from the relentless wind. Perhaps they planned to build a fire. Perhaps they intended to wait until daylight before returning to their tent. No one can say for certain. What investigators would discover next would transform this tragic accident into one of history's greatest mysteries. Because when search teams finally reached the campsite, they realized something immediately. The tent was only the beginning. The search begins back in Sverdlovsk. The days slowly passed. According to the expedition schedule, Igor Dyatlov and his team were expected to send a telegram after completing the route. A short delay was not unusual. Winter expeditions often took longer than planned. So at first, no one was alarmed. But as the days turned into a week, the silence became impossible to ignore. Families grew anxious. Friends began asking questions. Still, there was no word from the hikers. No telegram. No message. Nothing. On February 20th, 1959, the Ural Polytechnic Institute organized a search party. Students, teachers, and experienced volunteers headed toward the mountains. Soon, the Soviet military joined the operation. Aircraft searched from above. Soldiers and rescue teams combed the snow below. Every passing day reduced the chances of finding the hikers alive. Nearly a week later, on February 26th, the search teams made a discovery. High on the slope of Kolatsiakl, they found the expedition's tent. At first glance, it appeared strangely ordinary. The tent was still standing, partially covered by drifting snow. Its support poles remained in place. It had not been blown hundreds of meters away by the wind. It looked as though its occupants had simply vanished. As rescuers moved closer, they noticed something deeply unsettling. The entrance to the tent was closed, but several long cuts had been made through the side of the canvas. Those cuts had been made from the inside. Investigators carefully examined the scene. Inside the tent, they found sleeping bags, warm jackets, boots, food, medical supplies, cameras, maps, personal diaries, even money. Almost everything the hikers would have needed to survive had been left behind. There was no evidence of a struggle inside the tent. No signs that another person had entered. No indication that valuables had been stolen. Only one impossible question remained. Why would 9 experienced mountaineers leave all of this behind in the middle of a freezing winter night? Outside the tent, the snow held another clue. Footprints. Investigators followed them carefully. The tracks led downhill, toward a dense forest about 1.5 kilometers away. Some footprints showed boots. Others appeared to have been made by people wearing only socks. A few seemed almost barefoot. Despite this, the tracks did not suggest blind panic. Many appeared steady, almost controlled. It looked as though the group had walked away rather than run. The rescuers followed the trail. Every step increased the tension. The mountain was silent. Only the wind could be heard. There were no voices, no signs of life, only footprints leading into the forest. Eventually, they reached the edge of a giant cedar tree. There, they made the first heartbreaking discovery. 2 bodies lying near the remains of a small fire. They were identified as Yuri Doroshenko and Yuri Krivonishenko. The fire they had built was small, far too small to keep anyone warm in such extreme conditions. Nearby, the branches of the cedar tree were broken, as high as 5 meters above the ground. Some investigators believed one of the men had climbed the tree, perhaps to look back toward the tent. Perhaps to search for danger, or perhaps to look for the missing members of the group. No one knows. The condition of the two men revealed the desperation of their final hours. Both were wearing very little clothing. Their hands showed injuries consistent with exposure and contact with rough tree bark. Medical examiners later concluded that they had died from hypothermia. But their story was only the beginning. As rescuers searched the snowy slope between the cedar tree and the tent, they uncovered 3 more bodies. First, Igor Dyatlov, then Zinaida Kolmogorova, and finally, Rustem Slobodin. Their positions told a tragic story. All 3 appeared to be facing the direction of the tent, as if they had tried to make their way back, step by step, against freezing temperatures, powerful winds, and impossible odds. Rustem Slobodin had suffered a fracture to his skull. However, forensic experts concluded that this injury alone was unlikely to have caused his death. For these 3 hikers, the official cause of death was hypothermia. 5 members of the expedition had now been found, but 4 were still missing. Rescuers searched for days, then weeks. Heavy snowfall made the search almost impossible. Winter refused to give up its secrets. Only when the snow finally began to melt, months later, would investigators uncover the final chapter of the tragedy. And what they discovered would raise even more questions than answers. The final 4 for weeks, the search continued. Rescuers had already found 5 members of the expedition. But 4 hikers were still missing. The mountains remained buried beneath meters of snow. Every snowfall erased old clues and created new obstacles. The search teams refused to give up. They expanded their search area. They probed deep snow with long metal rods. They searched ravines, streams, and dense forest. Still, there was nothing. Then, in early May 1959, more than 3 months after the hikers had disappeared, the snow finally began to melt. What emerged from beneath it would become one of the most debated discoveries in modern history. The remaining 4 hikers were found inside a deep ravine approximately 75 meters beyond the cedar tree. Unlike the first 5 victims, these hikers were not lying on the open mountainside. They had reached a sheltered area. Evidence suggested they had attempted to survive. Investigators found branches, pieces of clothing, and the remains of a makeshift shelter. It appeared the group had worked together. Using whatever they could find, they tried to protect themselves from the freezing wind. It was a logical decision. In the forest, they would have had more protection than on the exposed mountain. But shelter alone was not enough. The 4 hikers were identified as Lyudmila Dubinina, Alexander Kolovatov, Semyon Zolotaryov, and Nikolai Thibault-Brignoles. Their condition immediately caught investigators' attention. These victims had not simply frozen to death. Several had suffered severe internal injuries. Nikolai Thibault-Brignoles had a serious skull fracture. Medical experts believed it was caused by an extremely powerful impact. Semyon Zolotaryov had multiple fractured ribs. Lyudmila Dubinina also suffered extensive chest injuries. Several ribs were broken. The force required to produce these injuries was extraordinary. The forensic examiner made an observation that shocked investigators. He stated that the injuries resembled those normally seen in victims of a high-speed vehicle collision. Yet there was no vehicle, no explosion, no obvious sign of violence, and almost no major external wounds. This unusual combination of severe internal trauma with relatively little damage to the skin would fuel decades of speculation. Some believed enormous pressure from compacted snow could explain the injuries. Others argued that the evidence pointed toward something far more mysterious. To this day, the debate continues. One detail received more attention than any other. When Lyudmila Dubinina's body was recovered, her tongue, along with her eyes and portions of soft facial tissue were missing. For years, this discovery inspired countless books, television programs, and conspiracy theories. Some claimed it proved the hikers had been attacked. Others suggested secret experiments, or even supernatural forces. But modern forensic specialists offer a more ordinary explanation. Because her body had remained submerged in flowing water beneath the snow for months, natural decomposition, combined with the activity of scavenging animals, could account for the missing soft tissue. There is no reliable forensic evidence that these injuries were deliberately inflicted before her death. Another strange detail soon emerged. Some of the hikers were wearing clothing that had originally belonged to other members of the group. At first, this seemed suspicious, but investigators reached a different conclusion. After 2 members died near the cedar tree, the survivors likely removed usable clothing from the bodies. In freezing conditions, sharing or reusing clothing would have been a desperate attempt to stay alive. Rather than evidence of foul play, it reflected the group's struggle to survive. Then came another mystery. During laboratory testing, investigators detected elevated levels of radiation on some items of clothing. The announcement sparked immediate speculation. Had the hikers been exposed to secret military weapons? Had they entered a contaminated area? Or was there another explanation? Even today, no direct connection between the radiation and the hikers' deaths has been established. Some researchers note that a few members of the expedition had previously worked in environments where radioactive materials were present, making incidental contamination one possible explanation. By the end of May, all 9 members of the expedition had been recovered. The search was over. But the investigation was only beginning. Every new discovery created another question. Every answer seemed to uncover another mystery. What had forced 9 experienced hikers to leave their tent? Why were they separated? What caused the devastating injuries? And why did the evidence refuse to fit into a single, simple explanation? The Soviet authorities now faced growing pressure to explain the tragedy. What followed would become one of the most controversial investigations in Russian history. The Soviet investigation. By the end of May 1959, all 9 hikers had been found. The search was over. Now, the Soviet authorities had to answer a far more difficult question. What had happened on that mountain? The official investigation was led by prosecutor Lev Ivanov. His team carefully documented the campsite. They photographed the tent, collected personal belongings, examined the footprints, and ordered detailed autopsies for each victim. At first, investigators searched for evidence of a crime. Had someone attacked the hikers? Was there a struggle? Had they encountered escaped prisoners or hostile locals? Every possibility had to be considered. But as the investigation continued, those theories became increasingly difficult to support. The footprints leading away from the tent belonged only to the hikers themselves. There were no confirmed footprints from unknown individuals at the campsite. No signs of robbery. No evidence that anyone else had entered the tent. Attention then turned to the region's indigenous people, the Mansi. The Mansi had lived in the Ural Mountains for centuries. Some early investigators briefly considered whether they might have confronted the hikers. But that theory quickly fell apart. There were no signs of a violent confrontation. No evidence connecting the Mansi to the deaths. In fact, members of the Mansi community assisted search teams during the rescue operation. Today, historians agree there is no credible evidence that the Mansi were responsible. Forensic examinations provided more clues. 5 hikers had died primarily from hypothermia. The remaining 4 had suffered severe internal injuries, yet none showed injuries typically associated with prolonged hand-to-hand combat. There were no knife wounds, no gunshot wounds, no evidence of murder. Another unusual finding appeared during laboratory testing. Some items of clothing showed elevated levels of radioactive contamination. The discovery immediately raised new questions. But investigators could not establish a clear connection between the radiation and the deaths themselves. Even today, experts continue to debate its significance. Meanwhile, reports began circulating from other people in the region. Several witnesses claimed they had seen glowing orange lights in the night sky around the same time as the tragedy. Some described them as bright spheres moving silently across the horizon. The reports were documented. But investigators never proved whether these lights had any connection to the hikers. Possible explanations include distant military activity, meteors, or atmospheric phenomena. No definitive conclusion was reached. As weeks turned into months, the investigation reached an uncomfortable reality. Every piece of evidence explained part of the story, but none explained all of it. Why leave the tent? Why walk into the freezing darkness? Why separate into smaller groups? Why did some hikers survive long enough to build a shelter, while others died attempting to return? Finally, the Soviet authorities closed the investigation. The official conclusion was brief and deeply mysterious. It stated that the hikers had died because of an unknown compelling force. No further explanation was provided. The case was closed. Large sections of the investigation remained inaccessible for years. Whether this was due to ordinary Soviet-era government secrecy, or because officials simply lacked a clear answer, remains a subject of debate. That single phrase, unknown compelling force, would become one of the most famous lines in the history of unsolved mysteries. It inspired books, documentaries, scientific studies, and countless theories. Some grounded in evidence, others driven by imagination. But before accepting any explanation, one question must be asked. Which theories are actually supported by the evidence? And which ones belong only to legend? Because over the next 6 decades, people around the world proposed dozens of explanations. Some were scientific, some were political, and some were almost impossible to believe. The theories for more than 60 years, people have searched for an answer. Scientists, investigators, journalists, survival experts, and ordinary people around the world. Each has looked at the same evidence and reached different conclusions. Some theories are supported by scientific research, others rely on speculation. In this chapter, we'll examine the most well-known explanations and separate documented facts from ideas that remain unproven. Theory 1. The avalanche. For decades, this was the official explanation many experts considered most likely. The idea is simple. A section of compacted snow, known as a slab avalanche, may have broken loose above the tent. If the hikers believed more snow was about to collapse, they may have cut their way out of the tent immediately, leaving behind their boots and heavy clothing. From there, they moved downhill toward the forest, where they hoped to find shelter. This theory also suggests that the tremendous weight of moving snow could explain the severe chest injuries suffered by some of the victims. But critics raised important questions. The slope did not appear especially steep. The tent was still standing, and investigators reported no obvious signs of a massive avalanche. For many years, these objections kept the debate alive. Theory 2. Powerful katabatic winds. Another explanation involves katabatic winds. These are extremely powerful, cold air currents that rush downhill at high speed. Such winds can create dangerous conditions, especially on exposed mountain slopes. Some researchers believe the hikers may have temporarily abandoned their tent, intending to return once the danger had passed. But in the darkness, they became disoriented and never found their way back. This theory explains why they walked toward the forest. However, it does not fully explain the severe internal injuries found on some victims. Theory 3. Secret military testing. Perhaps the most famous conspiracy theory claims the hikers accidentally entered a military testing area. Supporters point to reports of glowing lights in the sky and traces of radiation found on some clothing. Some have suggested experimental weapons, missile tests, or airborne explosives. However, Despite decades of investigation, no verified evidence has confirmed that secret weapons caused the hikers' deaths. Many historians believe the Soviet Union's culture of secrecy helped fuel these suspicions, even without direct proof. Theory 4. Infrasound. In 2013, one researcher proposed an unusual scientific idea. Strong winds passing over the mountain may have created very low-frequency sound waves, known as infrasound. Although humans cannot consciously hear these sounds, the theory suggested they might cause anxiety, disorientation, or panic. According to this idea, the hikers fled their tent in confusion, only to realize their mistake too late. While intriguing, this theory has not gained broad scientific acceptance, and there is currently no direct evidence that infrasound caused the incident. Theory 5. The Yeti. No mystery would be complete without legends. Over the years, some people claimed the hikers were attacked by a creature similar to the legendary Yeti. The idea gained popularity after a humorous photograph from the expedition showing a distant figure in the snow was taken out of context. In reality, researchers believe the figure was almost certainly another member of the hiking group. There is no credible evidence that a mythical creature was involved. Theory 6. UFOs. Reports of glowing orange lights, combined with the Soviet Union's secretive military programs, gave rise to another theory. Some claimed the hikers witnessed unidentified flying objects. Others suggested they encountered technology beyond human understanding. Despite these stories, no reliable evidence connects UFOs to the tragedy. Most investigators consider this theory speculative. What does the evidence tell us? When all the theories are compared, one fact becomes clear. No single explanation answers every question perfectly. The avalanche theory explains some injuries, but not every detail. Military theories raise interesting questions, but lack convincing evidence. The more extraordinary claims remain unsupported by credible investigation. The Dyatlov Pass Incident reminds us that real mysteries are often more complicated than fiction. Nature can be unpredictable. Human decision-making under extreme stress can be difficult to reconstruct. And sometimes, history leaves us with incomplete evidence. Yet science did not stop searching for answers. More than 60 years after the tragedy, Russian authorities reopened the case. New technology, new research, and modern forensic science would once again examine what happened on that frozen mountain. Would they finally solve the mystery? Or would Dyatlov Pass remain an unsolved legend? The modern investigation. For decades, the mystery remained frozen in time. Books were written, television documentaries aired around the world. Scientists examined the evidence. Amateur investigators proposed new theories. Yet one question refused to disappear. What really happened on Dyatlov Pass? Then, in 2019, Russian authorities made an unexpected announcement. More than 60 years after the tragedy, the case would be reviewed once again. Investigators returned to the mountains. They re-examined photographs, studied weather records, analyzed terrain, and compared the original evidence with modern scientific research. Unlike earlier investigations, this review focused primarily on natural causes. In July 2020, officials released their conclusion. According to the investigation, the most likely explanation was a slab avalanche. The report suggested that a compact layer of snow had shifted during the night. The movement may not have looked like the massive avalanches often seen in movies. Instead, it could have been a smaller but powerful collapse. Enough to threaten the tent. Enough to convince experienced hikers that they had to leave immediately. After escaping, the group moved toward the nearby forest. There, they attempted to build a fire. Some tried to return to the tent. Others remained in the trees, hoping to survive until daylight. One by one, the freezing temperatures claimed their lives. But one question still remained. Could a relatively small avalanche really produce injuries so severe? To answer that, scientists looked beyond traditional investigations. In 2021, researchers from the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology in Zurich, working with scientists from EPFL in Lausanne, published a detailed study. Using advanced computer models, they recreated the conditions on the mountain. The research suggested that, under the right circumstances, a delayed slab avalanche could generate enough force to cause the chest injuries documented in the autopsy reports. The study also showed that deep snow could reduce visible external injuries, even when internal damage was severe. For many experts, this became the strongest scientific explanation ever proposed. But not everyone was convinced. Some researchers pointed out that questions still remain. Why were the footprints so orderly? Why was the tent still largely intact? Why did some details seem difficult to fit into a single explanation? These questions continue to fuel debate. Today, many historians believe the tragedy was likely the result of several factors, rather than one single event. Extreme weather, darkness, powerful winds, heavy snow, confusion, and the desperate decisions people make when faced with what they believe is immediate danger. Perhaps there was never one mysterious force. Perhaps there was simply a chain of tragic events that unfolded in the worst possible conditions. Even so, without eyewitnesses, absolute certainty may never be possible. Final thoughts today. The mountain pass where the tragedy occurred is known as Dyatlov Pass, named in honor of the expedition's leader, Igor Dyatlov. Thousands of hikers now visit the region every year, not searching for treasure, not chasing legends, but to remember 9 young people who set out on an adventure and never came home. Their diaries, their photographs, and the silent mountain they left behind continue to tell a story that has fascinated the world for generations. Perhaps the mystery is no longer about monsters, or secret weapons, or impossible conspiracies. Perhaps it is about how fragile human life becomes when nature turns against us. And maybe the greatest mystery isn't why they entered the mountains. It's whether we'll ever know exactly what happened during their final night. Some questions remain unanswered. Some mysteries refuse to disappear. And Dyatlov Pass is one of them. If you enjoyed this documentary, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the Hidden Dossier, and turn on notifications for more true crime, historical mysteries, and unsolved cases from around the world. Until next time, stay curious and keep exploring the stories history could never fully explain.